All right. So my name is Professor Muhammad Khan Pasha. I am an associate professor at the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill University in Montreal, and the servant of Rasulullah Billah, whom you all just met. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to the last of the McGill Institute of Islamic Studies Winter 2023 Speaker Series. And today, the crowd cheers, we have Professor Lailatul Fitriyah, who is a professor, an assistant professor of interreligious education at the Claremont School of Theology. Dr. Fitriyah's dissertation research focused on the construction of feminist theologies in post-colonial Southeast Asia, and she looked at the lives of Indonesian female migrant workers in Singapore as sites for theological knowledge production within the frameworks of Islam and Christianity. Her work ranges from comparative analysis of Christian and Islamic feminisms, feminist interreligious dialogue, migration, religion, and decoloniality, and critical Muslim studies. She holds an MA in International Peace Studies from the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. And between 2015 and 2016, she was a Nostra Aetate Fellow at the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue in Vatican City. So she saw the Pope wearing that puffy jacket. Fitriyah, Layli, if I may say, regularly writes about the nexus of oppression suffered by religious and gendered minorities in Indonesia with the Indonesian political process and colonial legacies in the country. Her two, not one, but two upcoming research projects deal with the growth of interreligious relationships as a survival system within the communities of Indonesian female migrant workers in Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong, and the construction of anti-patriarchal epistemologies among Muslim and Christian women of the working class in Indonesia that interrogate patriarchy as a form of religious authority, as well as coloniality as a condition for knowledge production in Indonesia. Her research interests include comparative Muslim-Christian feminist theologies, Muslim-Christian relations, feminist interreligious dialogue, Islam and Christianity in Southeast Asia, religion, gender and migration, critical Muslim studies, decoloniality and border thinking, and the Islamic peace-building process. And Layli is similarly beholden to two cat lords, Oranos, who just blessed us with a sight of himself, and Dragos, who is in Reba, in occultation at the moment. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Fitriyah, whose talk today is entitled Communing with God in the Hideouts, Border Theology in the Lives of Indonesian Muslim Migrant Domestic Workers in Singapore. Big round of applause.
Thank you, Professor Pasha. Thank you everyone for being here to listen to my research, which I think will also be my first book project. And also thank you for paying your respect to Uranos and also Dragos, my two masters in here. So I will just share my screen, and I think I will spend 30 minutes, around 25-30 minutes to explain my ideas, and then we can continue our conversation with question and answer. Let me just share this. So everyone can see this well? Okay. All right. So my talk today entitled Communing with God in the Hideouts, Border Theology in the Lives of Muslim Migrant Domestic Workers in Singapore. And as Professor Pasha mentioned, this is actually a work of comparative theology because that was what my program was at Notre Dame. So there is a Christian component within this research, but in here I will only limit my explanation and our discussion into the Islamic component of the research. Just keep in mind that in every single element of these ideas and this research, there is always a dialogue that happened between the Christian, the Islamic and also Christian element within it. Let me see, there is chat. Oh, okay, yeah. All right. So what I want to explain to you first is this caveat that I have in my first book project. It's that this is a very personal and political project for me. So I will take you to a story, one of the stories in my life, which is my connection with my cousin Sari. So Sari, I grew up with Sari in my hometown of Jember in East Java province in Indonesia. And Sari was a very brilliant girl. She acted like, a good big sister to me. I remember that in her teenager years, she has goals to be a chemist because she was really good in science. And I always remember her as someone who helped me with my math homework when I was still in elementary school, because I'm really bad with numbers, and that's why I become theologian, right? So, so Sari, unfortunately, within her circumstances, she didn't have the opportunity to go to college. So after she graduated from high school, she went into, she got married with a man in her hometown in Malang, East Java. And then this man, in addition to abusing her in their family, he also actually left her with their son. So in order to be able to fulfill the needs of their son, Sari decided to go to Hong Kong to be a migrant domestic worker at that time. And after years in Hong Kong, she is still actually in Hong Kong right now, working as a migrant domestic workers. She had been in the third marriage right now, because every single marriage that she had has always been broke down because of abusive situation. And right now she has responsibility over 3 children who come from her 3 marriages, and she is still in Hong Kong working as a migrant domestic worker. The last time I talked to her, it was in February 2020, when I was back at home supposedly doing my second field work for this project. I went to Malang, East Java to visit my auntie, Sari's mother. And then I expected her to be there because I thought, she has been spending time in Hong Kong for a very long time. Why couldn't she retire and just take a rest at home? But unfortunately, she is not there, and she was still in Hong Kong at that time. And we had a video call when I was visiting Malang in February 2020. And at that time, it was the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the video call, Sari was sitting in a subway with tons of grocery bags around her, and she had a double mask. Her eyes was bloodshot red. She looked really tired, and she actually cried. She broke down crying, us about how tired she is with all the domestic chores that she has to do, and also with the whole pressure and social surveillance that comes from the COVID-19 pandemic in Hong Kong. And she said this to me in between our conversation. she asked me whether I'm already become a doctor. And at that time, I wasn't a doctor yet. And I told her, no, but I will be graduating soon and I will be a doctor soon. And then she said, I'm proud of you. As for me, please just pray to Allah for my safety so that I can come back to Indonesia in one piece. Or in Javanese, she used the terms moleh utuh. It means that, you know, please pray for me so that I didn't go home as a corpse, right? So this kind of resistance, this show of strength that I always witness from a woman like Sari and also other migrant domestic workers in Indonesia, because my hometown in Jember East Java is also one of the biggest exporters of migrant domestic workers in Indonesia. So I have a lot of neighbors, I have a lot of friends, childhood friends who are in the same position as my cousin Sari, fighting, struggling every day to get a little bit more money in order to finance and fund their children or their family back at home in Indonesia, and they actually sacrificing their safety, their comfort, and oftentimes their life for all of this reason. And so this is why for me this project is a personal one. I'm not coming into this project as an objective observer within a scholarly objectivity kind of position, who only observe these people simply to extract knowledge from them and then bring it back to North American academia in order to further my career. Of course, I cannot deny that as a first book project, it will probably further my career. But then I also have a very normative goal, a very political goal with this project, which is I believe that this project will help with the liberation of these women from the oppressive system that they're living in right now. And I care a lot about this. I'm very subjective about this because I am entangled within the personal connections that I have with these women. They are my friends, they are my cousins, they are my family, they are my people. So that is what I meant here by a personal and political project. And in general, this project is about embodied Islamic theology and Christian theology, of course, embodied Islamic theology and religious practices that I use as primary lenses to understand the MDWs intersectional oppression and their religious-based resistance. So in terms of method, I use several methods, but the two main ones I think is worth mentioning here. The first is this method called anthropological theology that was conceptualized by Todd Whitmore, one of my committee members at Notre Dame. So of course, this is built from more of a Christian theology perspective. But what anthropological theology is that this is a concept that trying to flip theological anthropology on its head. So theological anthropology within the field of Christian theology is about understanding human constitution through theological doctrines, right? So anthropological theology is about understanding theology through the details of human lives, meaning that the assumption is with anthropological theology, we cannot actually understand things, aspects about God, or we cannot actually build God talk without necessarily understanding the details of socio-political dynamics that happen within the lives of the believers themselves. Now that's anthropological theology. The second method that really also influenced my work is Halfi ethnography that was coined by Lila Abulugot in 1986. So Halfi ethnography is more of a positionality than a method. This is an ethnography that basically built from a perspective of a person who is at once outside and also inside the societies or the community that they learn about. And I do think that it resonates well with me because in one point I have one of my legs stand on, you know, my local community, my familial connection, my friendship connection with all of these women who work as MDWs in foreign countries. But then on the other hand, I also have another leg standing on, you know, the North American academia context. I was trained in North American University, and I also bring the result of my research back to you know, American universities, and the writing process itself actually take place in American universities. So this is what healthy ethnography means. So what it means is that the implication of healthy ethnography within the process of doing ethnography itself is that it actually blurs the binary between research subjects and the researchers. Unlike colonial anthropology that really put a clear line between who is the anthropologist and who is the research subjects, right? Anthropologist is usually, you know, white colonial person who come from colonial centers into colonized societies, and then observing these colonized societies for the interest of the empire. In health ethnography, because the ethnographer themselves is a part of that very society that they're learning about, that they're immersing themselves in, then that kind of power dynamics between the researcher and the research subjects is not really clear cut. I'm still up to today trying to reflect on and navigate the kind of connection that I have with my research subjects. And that is why in here, in this research project, I use the term dialogue partners instead of research subject, because I think they are not my research subjects. I talk to them, we are conversing with each other, we are learning about each other's life, and I learn from them as much as they learn from me. So I use the term dialogue partners instead of research subject in here as one of the implications of this healthy ethnography perspective. Now, I had done two field works that becomes the background of this dissertation research. The first is in the summer of 2018, in which I spent time in both in Indonesia and Singapore to you know, observe the lives of these migrant domestic workers. I participated in their activities. My goal was actually to try to live in as one of the migrant domestic workers themselves. So I would like to actually live in one of the employer's house and, you know, assisting with the chores and all of that. But unfortunately, that was very difficult to achieve. So what I did was at that time in summer 2018, I lived with a family of migrant workers too. In Singapore, they come from Bangladesh, a Bangladeshi family who work in the industries in Singapore. So the husband work in the construction industry, and then the wife work in a semiconductor factory. So I live with them. I live with a migrant family within an industrial park in Singapore, and then day by day, I met with several of these MDWs in outside of the house, and also by the weekend, I usually participated in their religious activities that is usually take place only in the weekend. So I think that's an important background to mention here. So in Singapore, there is this national regulation that's kind of not a regulation because it's not an obligatory thing to do. It's just a governmental suggestion for employers to give 1 day off every week to their MDWs to get out of the house and then socialize and all of that. Some of the employers do that, but some others don't. So it is very difficult to actually meet with these MDWs in terms of, meeting them in public spaces, because their work hours are really long. Some of them even extend to 24 hours a day. Most of them usually only have 3 to 4 hours of sleep every day. So what I do is usually, my meetings with them mostly take place in Saturday or Sunday, in which some of these, MDWs who have permission from their employers come out and they meet each other in public spaces. And in this Saturday and Sunday, that's when, religious activities in mosques, in churches, is much more, it's almost like a festival, right? Every weekend, because these women really, celebrate the fact that they can actually not do any chores one day a week. So they will come out and they have kind of, spiritual or religious party with their friends in churches, in mosques, or in public parks. So that's the context here. Now, in the spring of 2020, I also had my second field work, and it relates to the last point that I wrote. It involves a pivot in the field work because it happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. So what happened is that in the spring of 2020, I planned to go back to Singapore and did the same thing that I did in summer 2018. But then when I arrived in Indonesia by the end of January of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic, it's already kind of like, in the air in Southeast Asian region. And then I still have an immigration process to do at that time. And I plan to go to Singapore on March of 2020. And then right by the end of February 2020, Singapore closed its national border because they go to lockdown. So, so my research goes into the wind. So what I did was in that time, because I clearly cannot go back to the US also, because it's all in lockdown. Indonesia is also in lockdown. So what I did was I contacted my NGO network in Singapore, with whom I already worked with before in the 2018 research project. And I sent them some funding from my research funding to buy mode of communication, to buy cell phones for some Muslims and Christian MDWs with whom I want to be in dialogue with. And I basically fill up this cell phone with internet data every week. And then I actually converse with 5 Muslim and 5 Christians MDWs through this mode of communication. So what I did was because they will stop working like at 12 a.m. in the night or at 1 a.m. in the night. So that's when they can actually chat with me. So I will, wake up at 12 a.m. in the night, and then I would just, chat with them until like 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. It's up to their, discretion and their time, the time that they have. And I talked with them every day through WhatsApp, call, and also text. So that's how the spring 2020 and the pivot that I did went on at that time. So in total, I involved 40 dialogue partners in this research. They're mostly our MDWs who work in Singapore, but there are 10 of them who are also, NGO workers or Singaporean activists who advocate for the protection of the rights of these MDWs. Now, border theology. I don't think this is a definition. I think this is more of my analysis of the concept that I coined, border theology. And I kind of quoting, Walter McGill here by using this phrase, or where the theological knowledge is geopolitically located, right? Because McGill says that, every knowledge needs to be provincialized in terms of we need to contextualize them in specific geopolitical location, so that it doesn't become, dominant and universalized, as is the case with the European-based and American-based knowledge production. So what I meant by border theology is that first, it is a theology that is located within between traditional Islamic theology and the oppressive context that the MDWs live in. So they built border theology, they built the God talk, the Islamic God talk from in between spaces between these two contexts. And in here, I think the lenses of another thinking that has been coined by Abdul Kabir Khatibi and was quoted and explained in Walter McNaull's work in 2000 is something that's beneficial to understand this. So I see border theology as another theological thinking, which means that if we follow McNaull's explanation, it means that it is a thinking without the other. So it is a thinking that is outside of the binary of us versus them. And it also means that it always involves double critique. So whenever these MDWs express or embody it or talk about their theology, it is a theology that consists of double critiques of the traditional Islamic theology, directly or indirectly, and the critique of the oppressive context that they're living in, right? Now, for Khatibi, another thinking means that it is a thinking that doesn't try to dominate. It is a thinking that doesn't try to humiliate, because it is a thinking that is marginal and fragmentary. So it is a thinking that is not involved in epistemicide. So it means that this is a thinking that, because of its marginality, because of its fragmentary characteristic, then it is not dominant, it is not hegemonic. And this is how I see the kind of theology that these MDW women produce, because they just theologize for themselves. They theologize for the context in which they live in. So it is a kind of theology that doesn't preach, it doesn't pontificate, and it doesn't try to, struggle against other forms of theology, right? It is not reactionary. It is something that just come from that specific context and live for that specific context. Now, the second meaning, I think it also comes from the fact that this is a form of Islamic theology that is marginalized, and that's why it must be centered in lieu of Orientalist perspective on Islam and Muslims, right? Because especially when it comes to Indonesian Islam, scholars like Clifford Geertz, for example, have been classifying Indonesian Islam as, weak Islam in relation or in light of the expression of Islam that comes from Middle East, because of that association between, Islam must be Arabs, or Islam must be coming from the Middle East or North African region, or Islam must be South Asian. Right. So then the Islam that comes from Southeast Asia, especially from Indonesia, even though it is the largest Muslim majority countries in the world, it is something that is still very much marginal. And in terms of the Indonesian Islam itself, the Islamic border theology from this MDW woman is already marginalized. So this is like a double marginalized position of Islamic theology when we see it from that, background of Orientalist perspectives on Islam and Muslims. And Anibal Quijano's colonial matrix of power is a concept that I think is useful to understand this definition of Islam here, because that terms of, this is an appropriate Islam, this is not appropriate Islam, this is syncretistic Islam, right? This is authentic Islam. All of those, I think, is also a product of coloniality of epistemology. That is an aspect of colonial matrix of power that Anibal Quijano has mentioned. Now, another way to see it is that border theology within the lives of MDWs is Islamic theology that is formed within the interstitial spaces of three borders. And this is something that I propose in my research. The first is a border of belonging, which refers to that international border, that transnational border that the MDW woman has crossed in order to get their, in order to survive the lives that they have and their families have. So this, this border between Indonesia and Singapore is something that needs to be navigated by the MDW women every day in their life in Singapore, in their workspace. And then the second border is border of living, which is a binary between home and diaspora, right? So one example that can actually show this well is, many of these women with whom I talked to, they told me that even if they are located in Singapore, they are not in Indonesia, but the responsibility to actually rear their child and to actually surveil or to observe the children's, not surveil, observe the children's, development still fall onto their shoulders. So what these women do usually, most of these women who have children, right, in Indonesia, they will, stop working at 12 a.m. in the night, right? And then they will actually call their children back at home in Indonesia. And that happens every day. And they will ask questions like, have you eaten well today? Have you done your homework today? How is school? And everything like that. So even if those children are actually living within their extended family, the responsibility to take care of the children's life and the development of the children's life actually still fall on the shoulders of this woman. And of course, in another aspect, we can see this as an implication of that double burden of patriarchy, right? Where, women are demanded to work in public space, but it doesn't mean that, they will be exempted from their responsibility for domestic chores, because it just means that they have to do the double burden of the chores. So that is border of living here. And then border of subjectivity, which is the binary between the familiar or the familial and the other. So within their workspace, which is a personal space, right? They work in homes, they work in, the employer's bedroom, the employer's kitchen, etc. So there is this very ambiguous, connection that they have with their employers. Some of these employers actually exploiting the term familiarity or familiarity in order to exploit them more. So, for example, some of these MDWs women told me that their employers would say to them that they're like their daughters, that they're parts of the family. But then that kind of phrase, that kind of narrative will be used to, for example, justify the practice of cutting their salaries, right? So the employers will say, well, we are family, we live together, you are like our daughter, so we cannot really give you full salary this month, so please forgive us, right? So so that binary between the familiar or the familial and the other, it's always been also a double identity or a double life that that the MDW women need to navigate in their everyday lives. Now, this is just to give you a bit of a snippet about how actually Indonesian MDW is located within the socio-economic context of the Singaporean society. This is an ad for Indonesian maids, and it extols the virtues of Indonesian maids comparing with other maids who comes from other nations in Singapore. As you know, the salary range is just $550 Singaporean up to $700 Singaporean in a month. And there are words there that I highlighted at the bottom of this slides. So Indonesians are known as non-confrontational. They're submissive. They're obedient. They're good cook. They're good for elderly and child care because they're submissive, because they're obedient, and obedience is associated with patience, right? And they tend to not speak up. And because most of them are Muslims, they're not able to consume pork, but it doesn't mean that they cannot handle pork. In fact, a lot of these women with whom I talked to, they didn't actually want to handle pork. It's just that the demand of the work and also the demand of capitalism that commodify them as the perfect mate, as the perfect caretaker. Those are the aspects that actually force them to actually handle pork. And also to some extent, there are employers that actually, in order for them to make sure that the MDWs wants to handle pork, they will actually abuse the connection between employers and the employee, and they will actually, they will actually force the MDWs to eat pork without their knowing. So some of these women with whom I've spoken, they share with me stories, right? In which it was the first week of my life in Singapore, and then my employers was like, well, let's just go out and eat at a restaurant, right? And then they will go to a restaurant. The MDWs are happy, right? Because, oh my God, my employers is so good. They took me out to the restaurant. And then they will, the employers will order food for them, right? And then they will eat the food. And then the employers will say, well, what do you think of the food? And they will say, well, the food is really good. I like it. And the employers would then, say, well, what you ate, that was pork. See, pork is not that bad, isn't it? So they do something like that. They do a very systematic abuse of religious freedom in order to ensure that this woman would be available to take care of them and to serve them in whatever demand that they have, right? So now, another important element that I found in this research is that the formation of theological authorities at the border is very much different comparing with traditional, formation, the formation of traditional authorities in Islamic society. Oh, there is a chat here. Let me just. Oh, okay. Yes. That is a violent. So, so the theological authorities at the border hang upon these three aspects: social element, theological element, and epistemological element. So the combination of these three aspects actually form a specific theological authorities that doesn't fixate on hierarchical structure. It means that if you go to Singapore and ask these Muslim MDWs, who is your teacher in terms of, Islam, like from whom you learn about Islam, they will mention several peoples who are located in several mosques or several public parks, of whom all of those teachers are also MDWs themselves. So they actually develop a kind of religious community with their own resources, with their own form of theological authorities. These women who have been chosen as teachers of, religious teachers by their peers, they're not really actually having a traditional, Islamic authorities. They're not trained in madrasa. They don't really know anything about, Islamic fiqh or history outside of the common general history that people know. And their reading of the Quran is usually something that, Indonesian Muslims in general would say that, no, that's not a good reading of the Quran, right? But then they're all being elected by their communities as theological authorities or as religious teachers because of their connection with the communities. So the foundation, the epistemological foundation of Islamic theological authorities in this context is not a mastery or expertise in Islamic sciences. It is rather the caring and the responsibility that these women who are chosen as religious leaders have towards the MDW communities. For example, I talk with a Muslim MDW, let's call her Amina. Amina has been working in Singapore for more than 40 years. So she is of an older generation of MDWs. And every time there is a new Indonesian MDW who come to Singapore, they will be introduced to Amina because Amina knows the way to navigate Singaporean society, right? So Amina knows, who are the police officers in the Singaporean police department who are empathetical towards the cause of the MDWs. Amina know where the resources are. How do you get funding for your community activities? Amina know the people in the Indonesian embassy who are empathetical towards their cause, right? Amina know the languages that you should use to navigate and negotiate your salary with your employers, right? So these are the kind of things that becomes the epistemological foundation of Amina's authority. So every Saturday, Amina will go to a mosque in Singapore, and then she would teach other MDWs to how to read the Quran, and she would teach, simple fiqh like how to, take shower after, how to purify yourself after you get menstruation, things like that, right? And this is the kind of theological authorities that happen at the border. Let me see the chat. Okay, Nicholas, I will just answer that question after all of the presentation is over. Thank you for that. So that is the theological authorities at the border. And one of the most important thing that I want to mention here is that whenever I talk to the MDWs about Amina, they will use the language, yes, of course we know Amina. Amina is our mother, right? And then I talked to Amina and I asked her, why is it that the community trusts you so much? And then she said, because I am their mother, right? So this is the kind of, a foundation for the Islamic theological authorities that is happening in the border. Now, I have, presented this research project in several academic forums up to today. And one of the questions that usually comes is about Islamic authority in here, right? And people will usually ask me, well, aren't they also still following, the traditional fiqh? Aren't they also still following, the Nahdlatul Ulama, for example, in Indonesia? Nahdlatul Ulama is one of the largest Islamic organizations in Indonesia. And the answer is that they don't. They actually don't care about that. Not because of they don't want to care about Nahdlatul Ulama or about, who is the current imam or who is the current, clerics that who needs to be followed in Indonesia. Not because of they don't care about that, but because their socio-political context actually cut them off from the ties of traditional Islamic authority in Indonesia. They barely have access to the internet. They barely have access to cell phone, right? So what they have is their own community. And that's why it becomes a very, anti-patriarchal community then, by whatever implication that comes from that, that isolation, right? So, so these theological authorities at the border actually doesn't, it doesn't have any connection to the traditional Islamic authorities that that currently exist in Indonesian society. Okay, Now, in terms of God talk, or the ways this woman talk about God and understanding God, there are several, characteristics, I guess I could say that this woman used to explain God. But I only mentioned to you one here because, for the sake of time. So in my research, I found that there is an explanation about God of the runaways, and then God of the hiding places, God who remembers, God the shepherd, and God the answers of prayers, right? And now in here, I quoted a story for you from Elisa, 30 years old Muslim MDWs, which represent this characterization of God of the runaways. So this is a story when Elisa ran away from one of her employers. So she got breakfast at that time when she worked for that employers. She only got breakfast at 3 p.m. and it was only a slice of bread every day. And she sometimes need to work continuously for 24 hours, and then she had enough, right? And then one day she ran away at 5 a.m. She didn't bring anything with her. She didn't bring any clothes. She didn't bring any of her possession. What she brought just a little saving money that she had from actually cutting her employer's shopping money, and she got 10 Singaporean dollars in the forms of 5-cent coins, right? And then her employers was in Tampines, and she ran away to another region, another parts of the city called Ang Mo Kio. Now, if you know Singapore, from Tampines to Ang Mo Kio, it's impossible for you to get from Tampines to Ang Mo Kio with only 10 Singaporean dollars. At least if you take the cab, it's 60 Singaporean dollars, right? And this is how Elisa actually relayed her story and presented her story as a miraculous story in which God's hand directly helped her in her runaway process. So she said, I went from Tampines to Ang Mo Kio, and I could do that with $10 in my hand. If it wasn't due to Allah's protection, if it wasn't due to the help of Allah's hands, where will I be, right? Of course, we don't know, the detailed story about what happened in that runaway process. Maybe someone helped her. Maybe she got, a taxi cab driver who actually said, yeah, okay, let's just, pay me $10 because I take pity on you, right? Whatever happened, I don't think that's relevant. What is relevant is Elisa's way of presenting this as a God talk. What is relevant is this story represents Elisa's perception and perspective of what God or who God is. And who God is for Elisa is the one who literally held her hand when she ran away from the abusive employer's house and made that 10 Singaporean dollars enough for her, right? So this is the story of God of the runaways. And this is just one of the many aspects of God's characteristics as presented by this MDW woman. Now, another major element of border theology is the theodicies. It's the way they deal with the problems of evil. And there are 3 aspects here that I found in my research is that their theodicies are agentic, and they're relational, and they're transnational. What I meant by agentic is that some of them have theological accounts that respond to the problems of evil by reflecting back on what they did. So, for example, there's a story of Fatima. Fatima is 28 years old, MDWs in Singapore, and she had quite a life. So she worked in Singapore before since she was 15, actually. And she worked in Singapore for 5 years at that time. She saved enough, and then she went back home. And then she, met a guy, and then she got married to the guy. And then she, she built a shop, in a small shop in Indonesia. And then for some reasons, for some accidental reasons, the shop was burned down. And she basically, went back to zero. And then she went back to Singapore in order to work again and to accumulate saving money again in order to rebuild her life. And when I asked her, why do you think that happened? Why do you think that after all of you did your hard work, and then suddenly, your only livelihood, that shop, has been burned down? And then she said, well, for me, it is about what I did in the past. I think I had a lot of mistakes in the past, and then God give me that trial in order to purify, or in order for me to atone my bad deeds in the past. So this is what I called as reflective theodicy. And then there is a relational element in there, in some of these MDWs, women's theodicy. Relational here means that it's theodical accounts that respond to the problems of evil by highlighting the local network of relationships in which the MDWs are embedded. So we're back to Elisa here. So Elisa told me a story. She's a very experienced MDW. She has been working in Singapore for around 20 years. So she has been changing employers for several times. And then she told me at one point, there is this one employer for whom she worked. And this employer doesn't abuse her. He was a good employer in that sense. He paid her and all of that. But then she found that her salary from these employers, comparing with her salary from the previous employer for whom she worked with, the salary has the same amount, but it resulted into fewer material impacts in her life and her family's life. So she said, with my salary from my previous employer, I can actually buy a small paddy field, rice field in Indonesia. But from this employer with the same amount of salary, I can only buy a unit of television, right? So I asked her, why is that? Why do you think it's that? And she said, you know what? It's because my employer is a gambler. So she said that salary that comes from the gambling employer doesn't result in an equal, material impact for her, because that salary comes from dirty money, right? So there is an element of relationality there. So her bad situation doesn't come from her. It comes from the guy who gave her salary from gambling, right? So that it's not, it doesn't amount to the same barakah or the same blessing. So that is relational theodicy. And then there's transnational theodicy, which I found this account with all of the women that I talked to. So this transnational theodicy means that their theodical accounts respond to the problems of evil by focusing on transnational connection between the MDWs diaspora and their families at home. It means that they believe that the bad deeds or the good deeds that they do in Singapore, in diaspora, have a direct impact towards their family back at home. And that's why they want to be a good Muslim or a good Christians, because they don't want God to actually, give a disaster towards their family at home, because that's what will happen if they do bad deeds in Singapore, right? So this is some kind of, self-reflective moral surveillance kind of thing, because they keep their pietistic activities and their embodied religious practices in line with what God wants, because they believe that that will actually result in good things happening back at home in Indonesia. Now, another snippet of Singaporean society and their imagination about MDW's women. So in the year of 2019, I think, there is this government campaign. Now you cannot Google this because they already like clean it up, like the Singaporean government clean everything up from the internet. But in 2019, they launched a government campaign about how Singaporean society is respectful towards their maid. And in terms of, especially in relation with Malaysia, right? Singaporean society always pride themselves as a more, you know, welcoming and a better employers, right? For maids, comparing with the Malaysian society. And they believe that because they have a lot more regulations comparing with the Malaysian regulations on how to employ a maid, right? So this government campaign comes in the form of this anime kind of character called Care Lady. So Care Lady is a metaphor for MDWs, but just read here the what is and who is Care Lady. So Care Lady uses empathy to absorb all negativity or to send torrents of powerful emotions to her target. Not ordinary even in person, she is Diana Amperti, a female trillionaire philanthropist of unknown age. So their metaphor for MDWs is a perfect whiteish woman who is also a trillionaire who can actually do what the MDWs has always been doing for the Singaporean families. That is absorbing all negativity, being someone who can serve every needs that the family has without any demand, without any identity or presence, right? Because they're just becoming, the flowers on the wall, basically, right? But in here, they are being represented by a whitish, red hair, a trillionaire philanthropist, right? So this is a reflection of national imagination that the Singaporean society has about MDWs. And it comes with a bit of capitalist veneer, right? Which is a very, very ironical and very funny, I think. So now the third element of border theology is the embodied practice of religiosity that the MDWs shown. And in terms of the Islamic Muslim MDWs, I highlighted the practice of hijab here because hijab is a very, very important thing for a lot of Muslim MDWs in Singapore. So let me just give you a background, right? We have known about that, 1 day out, regulation that or suggestion that the Singaporean government gave to the employers. Now, if you go to Singapore every Saturday or every Sunday, usually Saturday, you will see in the morning, 6 a.m., right? In all subway stations, there will be like, groups of Muslim MDWs with their colorful hijab and their bling bling hijab and their abaya, and like they will come with full makeup on, and they will bring tons of cakes and food to share with each other, right? So it's like what I mentioned before, it's like a festival every Saturday. And many of them actually have prohibition to wear hijab in the employer's house. Because the assumption of being MDW is like what I also a bit mentioned before, they need to be a perfect commodity, right? A perfect commodity as a maid means that you don't have identity. You don't have anything that threatens the employer's perspective, right? So many of these Indonesian women, for example, who will go to Singapore for being MDWs, the agent in Indonesia will cut off their hair short, and they will be prohibited from wearing earrings. They will be prohibited from wearing any jewelry. They will be prohibited from bringing Quran or the Bible or wearing crucifix. Any identity, any personality, any subjectivity needs to be erased because they need to be a perfect commodity for these employers. And a perfect commodity means they are no one. right? They are no one who will serve these employers 24 hours in their house, right? So what happens in Saturday is that a lot of these women actually have hijabs and abayas in their cupboards, right? They just didn't wear it in their employer's house. So on Saturday, they will bring those abayas and hijabs into their bag, and then they will go to the subway station. They will change in the subway station's bathroom into their abaya and hijab. And then after that, once they come out and they mingle in public parks or in mosques or in churches, nobody will see them, right? Nobody will be able to differentiate, oh, that's my mate. Why is she there with hijab, right? So then this is the result, right? Like this picture. This is a group of Indonesian Muslim MDWs who actually celebrating one of their members' birthday in a public park with a pengajian. Pengajian means a reading of the Quran and also the praising of prophets with salawat together in a public park, right? So then there is an involuntary practice of occasional hijab. That's what I use here as a term, occasional hijab, because they can only wear hijab once a week in that Saturday. And then because of that elimination, systemic elimination of their identity, including religious identity, for them, hijab function as an embodied special practice. Whenever there are, groups of Indonesian Muslim women with hijab in public parks like this, or in mosques or in churches, the local Singaporean, the native Singaporeans, they know not to interfere in that space. They know that at that time, on Saturday morning until Saturday afternoon, that is the time for them to actually have that space, right? So this kind of very subjective, very individual practice of wearing hijab is also actually a group practice of putting that border, that imaginary border that actually give them a space to be themselves at once, for once a week in those hours, and actually living their lives as what they want to do instead of as a maid in somebody's house, right? And for them, for Indonesian Muslim MDWs who didn't wear hijab in Indonesia, a lot of them actually adopting hijab when they moved to Singapore because of these two narratives, right? The narrative of hijrah and the notion of hidayah. Now, hijrah, they said, I migrate from Indonesia to Singapore, and with this migration needs to come a better migration, which is a migration from my non-religious self to my religious and pietistic self by adopting the hijab. So that's the narrative there. And then the notion of hidayah, which means guidance, right? So they would say that, why do I adopt hijab at this time, in this context? Well, because the hidayah comes to me in this time, in this experience, in this context, right? So the practice of hijab is very religious, it's very pietistic, but also very social and very political for the Indonesian Muslim MDWs in Singapore. So that's the last element of this border theology. And thank you for listening to me for this time. I hope I just spent 30 minutes. I'm sorry if I spend more. Thank you.